Okay, let's get started. Um, in recent decades, a new kind of history book has come into vogue. It's an alternative approach to history, also called counterfactual history, and a couple of the more popular books are up on the screen there. The idea of counterfactual history is that history is not an inevitable march of dusty names, dates, and places, but a precarious careening ride that could have taken us to any number of destinations. So the idea is that throughout history, major events have occurred that could have gone totally differently, and the history subsequent to that event would be significantly different as well. So we're going to be looking at a number of what ifs. What if things hadn't turned out the way they did? How would the world that we live in, how would history be different? I want to apologize in advance that most of the stories that I'll use are U.S.-centric. A lot of the literature has been written by American historians, and consequently, most of the stories are focused on the United States. And I realize many of you here are from other countries, Canada, Great Britain, Australia. I've met people from so many different countries, and I've tried to, I recognize that you have other interests and other history, and so I've tried to mix in with the U.S. Kinds of counterfactual stories I'll be telling you, a few that are not quite as centric to the United States. So let's go ahead and get started and look at the first what-if question. What if the Mayflower had never sailed, or what if it had reached its planned destination? Let's talk a little bit about the Puritans and the Pilgrims. In the 1500s, the late 1500s, a group within the Church of England decided that the Church of England wasn't pure enough, and consequently they were called the Puritans, and they decided that they really wanted to worship differently. They wanted to purify the Church of England, and when they started to be persecuted and treated in a bad manner, they decided that they would separate themselves from the Church of England. They sailed over to Holland, and they were hoping that they would find greater latitude for worship, the way that they believed they should worship, a better location to raise their children, and so forth. And so they totally separated themselves not only from the Church of England, but from England as well. Now, interestingly enough, coincidentally, at that very same year, the Jamestown colony was founded in 1607. Now, 12 years after it was founded, by 1619, the Virginia Company, which was the commercial enterprise that established the Jamestown colony, it was facing bankruptcy. The crops had not prospered. Many people in Jamestown had starved, and they were thinking about just pulling up stakes and leaving Jamestown entirely. It was at that point in time that the Puritans had also become very unhappy in Holland. For one thing, they had not been able to flourish economically. The jobs had not been there. They were upset about the influence of the Dutch on their children. And they did not have the autonomy, the civil autonomy that they had sought when they had moved to Holland. So they were ready to move again. And at that point in time, a lot of things converged to create the history that we're familiar with. Sir Edwin Sandys was a landed gentry, a nobleman, who took over the Virginia Company. And this was totally unprecedented. At that point in time, the nobility generally did not get involved in commercial matters. But he took over that company, and he had a different philosophy about how to save the colony in the New World. He decided that he would recruit additional people to send over there rather than pull out the ones that were there, send new groups. And he was familiar with the Puritans, that persecuted small group. Apparently he had some contacts with that community, and It was through his influence that 2 charters were secured that enabled the Puritans to settle in the Virginia colony. And in fact, he was so invested in making that work that he loaned them 300 pounds of his own money without interest in order to finance their migration to the New World. And so it was that in September 16, 1620, a small commercial vessel that had been used to ship wine between the ports of England and the continent, named the Mayflower, set sail for the New World with the Puritans on board. It was a small cargo ship, 102 passengers plus crew. So it was not a large ship at all. It was a rough journey. It took months. In fact, as I'm on the stage here leaning back and forth, I'm thinking, what would it have been like in that small ship without stabilizers? I mean, they were sailing through the kind of ocean that we're in today and possibly even worse. People died. It was just a horrible, horrible journey. They were running out of food and water when they finally made landfall, but they did not see the land that they had expected to see. This was the route that they were supposed to take to current-day Manhattan. The charter for the Virginia Company only extended up to approximately here, the current-day Connecticut, it looks like. And so they had been authorized to land in the northern portion of the Virginia Charter Territory. As it was, they were blown off course and landed on Cape Cod Bay. They and by the way, as I was preparing the talk today, I was thinking they were probably the original undocumented illegal aliens. When you think about it, they were outside. They had no authority to be there. They were actually breaking the law by landing there, but they were so desperate that they had to. It was late in the season. They couldn't go out to sea again. They decided they would make the best of the situation. Now, many of the people who were in the Mayflower crew realized that this is a very tenuous situation, and there was a little bit of, let's say, a lack of comity, a lack of cooperation. Observing some not well affected to unity, that's an interesting way of saying everyone's really at each other's throat. It was thought good that there should be an association and agreement that we should combine together in one body. And so they formed a social contract called the Mayflower Compact. And 2 important aspects of it. First of all, they wanted to make sure that the King of England knew that they were still loyal subjects. So in that compact, they said they acknowledged their loyalty to the king. And then, they established a civil body politic to create just laws based upon the consent of the governed. And what a really radical notion that was, government based on the consent of the governed. So what if they had sailed to Manhattan? They would have been in close control and contact with other Englishmen. They would not have established their own separate identity, and they would not have established a society that emphasized the separation of church and state. That was a radical notion. After all, they had been persecuted for their religion, and they were going to make sure that any religion could flourish under the government. And so separation of church and state, but nonetheless, great emphasis on God and country. They were a God-fearing people. They were a patriotic people as well. The rule of just and equal laws that were established by the individuals, the citizens. And then, of course, they brought with them the Anglo-Saxon work ethic of thrift, sobriety, and hard work. And they established the notion that each individual community was responsible for its own success or failure. Very, very important notion. But as important as all of those things are, just as important was the idea that if they had not landed there, other European nations might have assumed sovereignty over that part of the eastern seaboard. This is a little bit hard to see on the wall here, but prior to 1600, the Spanish had all of what is current-day southern United States. And by 1650, the Spaniards were established here, and then we had the Dutch right in the middle there. We had the French up to the north. And if the Pilgrims had not landed at Cape Cod, it's conceivable that either the Spanish or the Dutch or the French might have settled that part of the eastern seaboard. So those are the consequences of the settlement of the Pilgrims in an area where they had not intended to go. Our next question: what if the colonial army had surrendered during the Battle of Long Island? Now, I don't know about you, but I had never heard of the Battle of Long Island until I did a little research. This is a list of the major battles of the American Revolutionary War. I think most of us are familiar with many of them. The Lexington Concord, the shot that was fired, the first shot fired, Fort Ticonderoga, which enabled the colonial army to gain a great deal of cannons that were used to defend Boston. Bunker Hill in the Battle of Boston. The invasion of Quebec, an attempt to invade Canada that failed. Dorchester Heights. The British were forced to evacuate New England. And then down at the bottom there's that battle that I just mentioned, the Battle of Long Island. August of 1776, just a month or so after the Declaration of Independence. The U.S. forces were forced to retreat to Manhattan from Long Island. Very, very easily, that end result might have been the U.S. forces were annihilated and Washington was captured. And that's the story I'm going to tell you right now. The Battle of Long Island. Long Island is just across the East River from Manhattan Island. And the forces, the British forces landed on Long Island. The Continental Army decided to meet them there in battle. And this was sort of one of the classic David and Goliath kinds of battles in history. As you can see, the British Army was far more prepared to prevail in this battle. 20,000 well-trained seasoned soldiers, 12,000 raw recruits who came straight off the farm, carrying their own rifles, ample equipment and arms, and the colonial army, they'd had nothing but what they brought with them. There were no tents, there was very little food and water. The navy of the English fleet was the supreme fleet in the world, 400 naval vessels, 10 ships of the line, the largest warships in the world. Not a single fighting ship among the colonial navy. Experienced leadership. They'd been fighting wars on the continent for decades. And Washington, the head general, had never led an army in the field. Well, as you can imagine, it was an unmitigated disaster. General Howe, the leader of the British troops, outflanked, outfought, and routed the Americans. 1,400 were killed, captured, or wounded. Most of Washington's staff were killed at that point in time, and it was just shaping up to be a terrible, terrible defeat for the colonial army. They were pushed back to the banks of the East River and the Bay, New York Bay. They were surrounded by the British, and it was only a matter of time before they would be annihilated. And as they were there in that cul-de-sac, awaiting for their final destruction, George Washington saw a fleet of British ships trying to sail up the East River to cut off any opportunity for retreat. He realized that their time was almost over. At that point in time, though, a strong wind came out of the northeast and blew the ships back into the harbor. And he realized, although the time was limited, there was an opportunity to escape if they would retreat back over to Manhattan Island. So he sent out the word to Manhattan Island, every kind of boat, ship, anything that would sail on the water, tonight, in the dark, bring them over to the shores of Long Island and help us to evacuate our army. And as I was reading about that, I was thinking about the evacuation of Dunkirk in the Second World War. The same idea. All of those private boats that were used to evacuate the British to escape the Nazis. Well, the evacuation commenced during the night, and it went without any problem. Under the hidden darkness, they muffled all of their metals, and they were able to quietly evacuate. And during the night, the British were totally unaware. Fires were built to provide a ruse that, in fact, the whole army was there. Men would maintain fires while most of the army was evacuating by the river. But as it got closer and closer to the morning, a third of the army still was on Long Island. And with the rising of the sun, that army, that third of the Continental Army and Washington, he was still on Long Island, would have been decimated when the British realized that they were retreating. Well, the evacuation went masterfully. Washington did a wonderful job. He had been outmatched in the battle, but during the retreat, he really rose to the occasion. Two keys to the success of the evacuation of the army. Number one, in the army were a lot of fishermen and sailors from Salem and Marblehead and various fishing towns along the coast of current-day Massachusetts, and they were the ones who manned the boat, tirelessly going back and forth on their small watercraft. That was a very important thing. But another very important thing that saved that remaining third of the army and Washington, the fog rolled in. Just as the sun was coming up, a massive fog rolled in. It was so very dense, was the atmosphere, that I can scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. And so it was that the remaining third of the army and Washington were able to evacuate Long Island. And when the fog went away, the British saw that there were no more colonial troops on Long Island. They had been outfoxed. So, what if the wind had not come from the northeast and kept those ships out in the bay? What if the fog had not rolled in at that very moment when it would make such a difference? Washington, and when half of the Continental Army would have been captured, and with that having happened, the American Revolution would have been finished, possibly, at that very early stage, or extended indefinitely. George Macaulay Trevelyan, who is one of the most eminent American historians, wrote, "When once the wind changed and the leading British frigates had taken Brooklyn in the rear, the independence of the United States would have been indefinitely postponed." And it's truly interesting and highly ironic that in fact, I'll read this. Ironically, 5 years later, in 1783, the same circumstances prevailed. A trapped army with the sea to its back, but that time there was no divine intervention. When Lord North heard that Lord Cornwallis had surrendered at Yorktown, he exclaimed, "Oh God, it's all over." The same statement might have been heard in the halls of the Continental Congress in 1776 if the wind on the East River had not changed and the fog had not rolled in. What if Napoleon had established a French empire in North America? I need to start this story by telling you a little bit about Saint-Domingue. This is a picture of a map of current-day Dominican Republic and Haiti. It used to be called Hispaniola during the time of the Spanish colonial period. But by the time of period of time that we're looking at, France controlled the far western end of the island. What is current-day Haiti was at that point in time called Saint-Domingue. And it was the most wealthy colony of all of the European colonies. It was the source of 60% of the coffee that was consumed in Europe, 40% of the sugar. It was a cash cow for France. It became that way because the French imported 500,000 African slaves by the end of the 18th century. The ratio of free men to slaves was 1 to 156. And so it was a highly slave-based culture and economy. And it was a horrible, horrible thing, as you might imagine, for the slaves. And they were always trying to revolt against their plantation masters who treated them so badly, but they were unable to do so. And then along came the French Revolution. Between 1789 and 1799, France, the government of France was in great turmoil, and the radical Jacobins, towards the end of the French Revolution, became the predominant ruling party, and they issued a declaration freeing all slaves in France's colonies. Now you can imagine what kind of an effect that had on those 500,000 slaves in Saint-Domingue. It was such a wonderful thing, but the plantation owners kept them down. They under the rule of force, kept them as slaves. And as you can imagine, it was even more turmoil at that point in time. And that law that was passed by the radical Jacobins was reversed when Napoleon Bonaparte became the ruler of France in 1800. And he decided that he would reimpose slavery in Saint-Domingue. Now, all of these events came together to cause a major uprising of those slaves. And Napoleon sent an army of 20,000 French soldiers, the cream of his army, under the command of General Charles Leclerc, sent them to Saint-Domingue to put down the rebellion of the slaves, and he had secret orders that after he had successfully done so, he was to proceed with his whole army to New Orleans to establish a French empire in North America. Well, a civil war of absolutely unparalleled, unbelievable ferocity broke out. Massacres and counter-massacres. The French issued an order to the effect that all natives, all slaves above the age of 12 were to be killed. And it was just an absolutely horrifying situation. The French army, as you might imagine, was able to gradually exert its influence and power and was successful over the slaves. But then along came yellow fever. And we've talked about yellow fever when we talked about the French effort to build the canal, the American effort to build the canal, and so forth. Leclerc's troops started dropping like flies. Most of his personal staff died, and he himself died. And with those deaths, with the advent and the influence of yellow fever, the dream of a French empire in North America died as well. While all of this was going on back in Europe, Bonaparte was on the verge of another war, this time with England, and he was running out of money. And so he was trying to find ways to raise money. At that point in time, Robert Livingston, the U.S. ambassador to France, as well as James Monroe, a special envoy of the president to France, were negotiating with Bonaparte for the purchase of New Orleans. That was the gateway to the Western territories. And so they thought, this is really the best we can do. And so they were trying to buy New Orleans. and Napoleon dropped a bombshell on them. He said, how would you like to buy the entire territory, the Louisiana Territory? And that happened. The Louisiana Territory was purchased, 868,000 square miles for $15 million or 3 cents an acre. What a wonderful deal the United States got on that occasion. So, the French, as you can imagine, having their troops decimated in Saint-Domingue by yellow fever, from 20,000 down to 8, they had the humiliating experience of evacuating the country and surrendering to a British fleet with whom they were at war by that time. They surrendered to a British fleet that was sailing just off the coast. They wanted to do that rather than stay in Saint-Domingue because after they left, every single white person was massacred in Saint-Domingue. And just a side note, as many of you realize, Haiti is the most impoverished country in the Western Hemisphere. From that point in time, for a century or more thereafter, they were outcasts from the international community. No European nation would have anything to do with them, and that contributed to the lack of development of Haiti, current-day Haiti, and its impoverishment today. So they fled Saint-Domingue, and that chapter of French history was closed. So what if Leclerc's army of 20,000 people had sailed to New Orleans and had established an empire there? Eventually, Napoleon was defeated in Europe. He would have fled to that North American empire. And who's to say that his charisma would not have electrified the fighting men of the West, those frontiersmen who would have joined forces with him? And of course, the British would have followed after him to try and capture him. They would have dispatched a huge fleet. There probably would have been another Battle of New Orleans rather than the one that took place in the War of 1812. But it would have been a battle between the French and the British, and possibly the French would have been led by Andrew Jackson, rather than Andrew Jackson leading the United States Army in the War of 1812. Well, and what if the British at that point defeated them? They would have controlled New Orleans, the city that controlled the whole heartland. They would have claimed as spoils of war the entire Louisiana Territory. And a biracial colony of free blacks and whites, you can imagine that coexisting alongside of the southern Confederate states. Perhaps there would have been a gradual emancipation, and the United States Civil War might have been avoided if all of this had happened. Interesting to speculate. What if Pizarro had not found potatoes in Peru? Now, isn't that an exciting subject? Wow. I didn't share with you that was one of the questions because you thought, oh my gosh, what a boring topic. Well, potatoes had more effect on the history of the world than all of the gold and silver that the Spaniards brought back to the old world. So let's take a look at this story. This is sort of a very busy chart, and let me walk you through it. We're talking about English farms in the 18th century, and these are the 4 major crops that were grown in England in that century, and I'm sure that was true in Europe as well. Average yield per acre in bushels. Look at these numbers. The average yield for potatoes is more than 10 times more than any of those other crops. And if you look at the energy value of the food, in other words, its ability to sustain life, and that's measured in a unit of measure called megajoules, 31,900 megajoules, we're still talking about an acre. Almost 32,000 megajoules are associated with potatoes. The next larger number is 11,400 for barley. So the nutritional value, the ability to sustain life, was significantly more for potatoes. And sort of crunching all of those figures and making them meaningful, the land required to provide 42 megajoules, which was the amount of megajoules to sustain 2 adults and 3 children. The amount of land required for that family to live was only half an acre, as opposed to more than 1 acre for the other crops. Potatoes have the unique ability to grow more quickly, to grow in virtually any kind of environment, and to provide a nutritional value that exceeded significantly any of the other staple crops that were being grown at that period in history. And they included every vital nutrient except calcium and vitamin A and D. And so a family of 5 or 6 could have a half-acre farm, grow potatoes, and have a cow, and that was self-sustaining. That was enough to support the family. As some of you who were in my earlier lecture on the Incas will recognize these next couple of slides, potatoes originated in the border between Peru and Bolivia in this area right here, and were an important staple crop, the most important staple crop of the Inca Empire. And that was the fuel that enabled the Inca army to proceed and conquer additional territories. Well, the Spaniards sailed back to Spain with all of their treasures, and the food that sustained them on their journey back to the Old World was maize or corn and potatoes. And that gradually introduced potatoes into Spain. The fishermen from the Basque province, very renowned for their ability to fish, they would sail to the fishing banks off of Newfoundland and Massachusetts and Maine and so forth, using potatoes as their source of sustenance. On the way back, they would stop in Ireland in order to replenish their supplies, and that's how potatoes got to Ireland. But gradually, by 1600, potatoes had generally spread across this entire map that we're looking at. But potatoes were not cultivated intensively. They were not cultivated in a large scale because a lot of things were going on at that period of time, not the least of which was the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648. This was a horrific religious war. As you can see, the different religions that are listed here, back and forth over that 30 years, rampaging armies would go back and forth. And the poor people who lived in the countryside, as you can imagine, those armies swept up all of their food. And there was mass starvation for the people who happened to be living in that part of Europe during that period of time. It was just a terrible tragedy. Well, approximately in the next century, along came a ruler, Frederick the Great of Prussia, and he was he had studied history. He had seen that horrible tragedy in the preceding century, and he believed that potatoes were very, very important to avoid a similar tragedy in the future. And so he tried to introduce potatoes. By the way, one really unique feature of potatoes is that the tuber grows under the ground. And so an army that's scavenging the countryside for food would not be able to find the food that was in the ground. So the farmers would be able to continue to survive based on these hidden food stores. Well, he introduced a major effort to market potatoes. He sent agricultural extension agents out into the countryside with seed potatoes, and this is how you grow them. And it was a major effort, and it was a total failure. The things have neither smell nor taste. Not even dogs will eat them. So what use are they to us? Town of Coburg's response to the king's order. He was a master psychologist, though. What he did, he had a large farm, and he put armed guards on the border of his farm. And he planted potatoes on that farm, and he forbid any of the local farmers to come and see what they were doing. Now, if you had a farm that was right next to that farm, what would you be doing about 1 o'clock in the morning? It worked. Potatoes began to spread throughout Prussia and into other countries, and with a very relatively short passage of time, potato cultivation had become widespread throughout Europe. And there were significant implications for that. That well-fed population exploded. When people had plenty of food to eat, what happened to the size of the family? It grew because they could support more children. And many of the people living in the country migrated to urban areas. And that migration to the urban areas enabled the Industrial Revolution. It didn't take so many people to till the land to support a large urban population. And so potatoes actually fueled the Industrial Revolution. Now, this is a wonderful story up to now, but potatoes became so dominant that people stopped growing other things. It was a monoculture, and that's a very vulnerable situation if a problem develops with that crop. And in 1845, a virus arrived from the New World called the potato blight. It killed the plants. It made the potatoes rot that were in the ground. And mass starvation followed. In Ireland, this is a map that indicates the percentage of the population who were receiving their food from the welfare agencies in existence at that time. And these red and very dark red areas denote the population that were almost totally dependent upon the providing of food from the welfare agencies. 1 million people died of starvation as a result of the potato famine, 12% of the population. And that was just in Ireland. Of course, there were similar problems in other countries as well. But those kinds of difficulties then had a predictable result. Immigration. My grandfather McClelland and his family immigrated from Ireland in the early 1880s. It was a result of the famine that occurred that we just looked at. And by the way, there were subsequent famines and subsequent incidences of blight. 1.5 million immigrants came to the United States, not only from Ireland, but from many other European nations. And it was those people who expanded the railroads, built the canals, built the factories, and staffed the factories. Very, very important to the growth and expansion of the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So in summary, without potatoes, population growth in Europe would have been much more gradual, and it would have taken a long time to grow the large population that supported the Industrial Revolution. That would have been delayed significantly if potatoes had not been the major crop. And of course, reduced migration to the United States would have slowed down the development of the United States. So those are some of the most important implications of potatoes in the Old World. And that's the end of our lecture today. But tomorrow I've got one last lecture, and it's sort of a part two, what if? And these are the questions that I'll be talking about tomorrow. What if the Chinese had established settlements in the Western Hemisphere before the Europeans? What if Sir William Pitt had not been diminished by illness? Would the American Revolution have occurred? Probably not. And what if Lincoln had not issued the Emancipation Proclamation? And finally, I'm going to take the information that we talked about earlier in the cruise on Cortez's conquest of the Aztecs and ask the question, what if he had failed to conquer the Aztecs? So I hope you'll rejoin us again tomorrow for the last lecture. Thank you.